welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon on Halloween and the first day of Diwali. So Eddie and I are here to chat through a complex but important and nuanced topic with measuring impact in medical affairs. The discussion intended today is more of a discussion between Eddie and I, where Eddie can provide his perspective being in medical affairs. I can provide my perspective being in tech. It is intended to be a more informal discussion, and we love dissenting opinions. We want this to be kind of a group conversation. So a lot of the topics here are meant to engage you guys as well in terms of giving feedback or giving opposing views, because I think as a community, that is ultimately what will help kind of refine how do we measure impact? What does impact actually stand for? So Eddie, did you want to add anything before we kick off introductions?
No, I think that's absolutely right, Vera. I think we recognize that this is a hot topic. It's one that's debated and discussed, frequently. And I think we're making progress, but today's there to share some ideas, share some thinking, and hopefully hear from all of you as well and get your perspective on things.
Thank you, Eddie. And with that, not to put you on the spot again, but would you be open to sharing a bit of an introduction of your background? Because I know I cannot do it justice as well as you can.
Absolutely, Vera. So, Eddie Power, I'm CEO of Empower Medical, which is a consultancy focusing on medical affairs, been in existence about just over a year. But before that, I've had 25 years experience in the pharma industry, primarily in medical affairs, but also a couple of stints in clinical development and marketing. So, quite a broad range, and I've seen a number of metrics, KPIs over the years. And for me, what's changed really more recently is more of a weighting and a shifting to medical affairs. And of course, with that comes an accountability and how we can show impact and showcase value. So that's, Vera and I have been discussing this for quite a long time, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today, Vera.
Thank you, Eddie, for that introduction. I love that you have such a varied perspective across the different roles, inclusive of clinical development and commercial, because medical affairs is such a cross-functional role from a communication perspective. So I'm excited to chat with you today. And for everyone, we do have a YouTube video from back almost a year ago now, where we had this discussion on measuring impact in medical affairs. So I'd be curious how this discussion today changes from that. I think that was 8-9 months ago. So a little bit about my background. Hi, everyone. My name is Vera, founder and CEO at HXAI. We work with medical affairs teams to help them measure the impact of their efforts leveraging technology. So my background's really technical. I used to work at Facebook and Uber. And at Facebook, fun fact, before Gen AI became this hype thing now, I worked on one of the first summarization algorithms for when you would share a news article on timeline. So this was a decade ago. So we know AI, NLP, all of those buzzwords have been around for quite a while, but it's been interesting to see this resurgence of Gen AI and the impact it can potentially play. So excited to be here to engage in the conversation and share the perspective of where technology can come in helping medical affairs on this journey. So with that, one logistical thing, if you guys have questions throughout the talk or the presentation, we'll have some time at the end. But if you want to take a picture of this QR code and just go to the page, you can just add those questions. I'll be monitoring them. And then we might even, throughout the presentation, pop those questions in as well. All right, so let's kick off the topic. So, I think the most important thing at the beginning is really we have to establish the definitions, right, of what is impact or what does value of medical affairs really mean? Because similar to how insights as the word, I feel like has very different definitions depending on who you're talking to. Impact and value, and in a way, success is also an evolving topic. So I'm curious, Eddie, how do you define what success means in medical affairs?
Yeah, so to me, success, very simply put, is to show that you've had an impact somewhere on the healthcare continuum, whether it be at an HCP, at a patient, at a system level. But also, as you were alluding to at the beginning, medical affairs covers a broad scope of responsibilities. So there's also what I think of as internal success, right? Is there some kind of impact or value that you can add results in a change in strategy that may result in a great business opportunity. And I know we'll get to some of the definitions in a couple of slides around impact and value, but it's something that I think we need to showcase. We need to be able to communicate and be able to articulate that to senior management, to senior leadership, to cross-functional partners, to our peers, and also the external healthcare community, whether you're a provider or a patient.
And I'm curious to kind of follow up on that in the sense of what do you feel like has shifted over the last couple of years in this definition? Medical affairs, to me, from kind of my perspective, seems to be, grown a lot over the last 5 to 10 years and has become a lot more cross-functional, getting involved potentially as early as phase one studies, depending, all the way to post-launch. So I'm curious how you've seen the concept of measuring success in medical affairs evolve.
Yeah, when I started in industry, 25 years ago, much of the medical success, try to frame it that way, was really predicated upon relationships and, very heavily weighted towards that, regardless of whether you were in a headquarters role, an MSL type role or a hybrid role. And there's been, I think, a shift in accountability over time where, don't get me wrong, relationships may still be important, but there's also much more emphasis now on effective communication, on being able to articulate a story, on being able to engage and communicate with healthcare providers who may not be key opinion leaders, who may never publish, who may never go to a congress, but are so critical in managing patients, in making clinical decisions, even if they don't prescribe. And just that whole stakeholder landscape has evolved so much, to encompass others like payers, like governments, like regulators, that I think we've had to evolve and really hone down as to what success means and how can we actually measure it and show it.
So it almost, from what I'm hearing you say, one big characteristic of what has shifted over the last couple of years is that the type of stakeholders that medical affairs is scientifically engaging with has really changed and become a lot more varied, where almost I would also translate that into, the storytelling or the way that the communication is done has to also be very different, likely depending on the stakeholder. And also the impact metrics have to be reflective of that diversity of stakeholders.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the one thing I would add, Vera, as well, because sometimes, memories can be short, but I think with medical affairs in particular, there's also a responsibility to increase trust, and credibility. And some of that can be measured too, right? I mean, it could be through surveys, through sentiment analysis, or whatever it is. But when I started in pharma, with all these industry reputation indices, pharma ranked even lower than tobacco companies. And
Oh, wow.
we only have ourselves to blame, but I think that reputation aspect is something that we should keep foremost and top of mind.
And not to, I know we're going to save the questions for later, but I think Robin had a good one. So I'm going to throw it in here for you, Eddie. So
Yep.
Robin asks, do you think the metrics of success may be different when the focus is on measuring success based on impact on the patient versus focusing on proving our worth to other functions, for example, commercial?
Yes, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that impact and even more so value can mean different things, right, to different stakeholders. And just use like a medical example, right? If you're using something like diabetes and trying to hit an A1C number and you hit it, that's impact. But the value that it brings to different stakeholders might be different, right? For the patient, it may be better quality of life, less repeat visits. For the healthcare system, it may be longer term, more kind of preventive wellness approach, rather than to be treating illness all the time. And I think this slide, encapsulates, right, a lot of that thinking where, when I think about it, it's very simplest because we sometimes have a tendency to complicate things. Impact is in essence about affecting some type of change, right? And it could be behavior, which could take the form of action. If you take information and then you act on that, or you factor it into your decision making. It could be some kind of change in a policy type approach, public health, or you can think of treatment guidelines as a form of policy. And it could be process, right? It could be a patient treatment algorithm that changes, right? It could be how integrated a patient is when he or she flows through a hospital and then all the way through to primary care. And the way I think of value, which is really derived from impact, is that in some way you're fulfilling a need, right? Is it for an HCP, maybe, okay, now I have another treatment option that I consider, for a patient. It may be, am I going to feel better or am I going to get better? For a healthcare system, it may be a need to better manage their patient population and allocate resources. And you can look at that internally as well, right? If you bring back some kind of impact that changes an internal strategy, or whether it be medical or corporate strategy, whether it be a pipeline or a business development strategy, that's kind of the impact. And then the need for the company can be different. It could be more stakeholder value, as an example. So they're linked, but I see there's a difference. And the Venn diagram, I think, encapsulates that the needs and the perception of value may be different depending on the stakeholder. Hopefully that helps to answer Robin's question.
Yeah, and I think that was a great segue to this topic of how do we actually define impact, right? Or how do we actually potentially look at the holistic value of medical affairs? And, I think to Robin's question, that Venn diagram of within a company, right? You even probably have your own Venn diagram of clinical development, medical affairs, or maybe even internal teams, field medical, med info, to commercial. And all of those teams also have their own perspectives of what their needs are. So it's almost like that Venn diagram in a way is like another axis of defining specifically what value might look like for medical affairs, because that there isn't like one golden value measure, if you will.
No, and Vera, what I would add, right, that it's always important to look at value in terms of what the stakeholder considers value. So, and almost like kind of start from that and work backwards. Too often I think in the past we've fallen into the trap, and I've been there before, where we think we know what the value is, right? And we decide on the communication or the elements that we think should be pushed out. But I think it's a whole different dynamic right now with things like social media. In the past, there were a kind of self-chosen few in the medical communities who published and had a voice. Now everyone, right, in the broader medical community has a voice. They can have opinions, they're heard, and they don't have to be academic opinion leaders by any means, right? Any kind of healthcare provider, any patient, any caregiver now has a platform where they are heard.
Right. It sounds like to me from also what you're saying is that what value might mean for, let's say, like a digital opinion leader who is, garnered this platform. Maybe they don't publish research, but they have an influence, right? Because they have this platform, they're communicating their quote needs, showing value to them might be very, very different than a KOL that has done 30 plus years of primarily research or clinical trials, even though they might both have medical backgrounds and be, in the same therapeutic area.
Absolutely.
And you can break that down further. So, and Robin also made a really great point. Thank you, Robin, for your question around, value may come on a longer term time scale that it's harder to measure in shorter term quarterly results, which I think is an interesting point, and we should take a note to dig into that. So with that, now that we've defined roughly impact, if you guys have different definitions of impact and value, I would actually be curious to hear. So feel free to throw a comment into the chat, and that would be super appreciated. So with that, if we presume that this is the definition of impact and value of medical affairs, there comes the point to now, how do we execute on that? How do we actually measure the impact and measure the value and show that, whether it's internal, within the company to external to various stakeholders. So with that, what typically we've seen teams do, and, Eddie, feel free to add your thoughts into here, but as a team, right, whether that's on quarterly or an annual basis, you're likely setting those scientific objectives improve X patient outcome, hopefully more impact oriented than necessarily activity oriented objectives. And then those objectives get translated into tactical execution across various medical affairs activities, right? Field medical, med edu, med info, etc. But in between, there's the impact gap, if you will, where it can be difficult and complex to be able to measure how are our efforts driving those scientific objectives. So curious, Eddie, how have you seen this, play out? What do you agree or disagree with?
No, definitely. I mean, there's a place, right, for both activity and outcome-based metrics, right? Depending on what you want to do with it. And I think like your activity-based metrics feed in very well into that resource allocation, type approach. Because if you're looking, say, at an MSL and where HCPs are allocated and how many engagements are occurring, you can use that, right, to allocate your MSL teams differently. It doesn't all have to be geographically equally dispersed. I think we've seen more recently, is more of this focus on outcome, because things like engagement often provoke the question, so what? And I had 100 engagements in the last 3 months, and then it's okay, so what? And sometimes getting from that strategy, which is at a broad team, department, even organizationally based level, down to an individual level. It's, as you call it, that kind of impact chasm that's in there, often starts getting lost. And sometimes it's systemic, Vera. Sometimes it's the way that companies incentivize their people, where, at an individual level, right, it becomes very much individual rather than team based. Whereas if you're a leader, right, of a particular function, you're looking at it much more organizationally wide, and what impact, right, or what outcomes is the team achieving. And I think clear and open communication and setting clear expectations is very much what I think should be driving what we do. But those three, I think, are a very nice overview. Those objectives, right? You've got one that's very externally based. The middle one is more internal based. Again, internal stakeholders are equally as important, right, if you're trying to be successful in a business. And then you've got your activity that leads more to operational. And then how you kind of feed that continuity through to the execution and keep them there, right, takes a little bit more forethought and thinking to try and pull through those outcome-based metrics, right, or objectives at the individual level.
Yeah, and I know I went a little early to this slide because, Eddie, you started to touch on a couple of things that I've also seen and heard, which is typically we kind of look at the current state of what at least I've observed with medical affairs teams who are trying to, in their best efforts, to measure the impact of their various activities. They tend to be very much activity or operational metric oriented, right? So to your point, 100 HCP engagements, or we ran, 45 med edu programs and reach, X number of HCPs, which you need the activity and operational metrics because you need to ensure, MSLs are doing activities, right? Like they are engaging with KOLs or DOLs or HCPs, et cetera. But I think the challenge in that is that activity or operational metrics are oftentimes not necessarily correlated or indicative to actual impact of did that activity drive, did the HCP have a better understanding of, diagnosis criteria for, or what to look for in a rare disease, as an example, right? And part of that might be hard to measure. So I do think there's also this element of operational metrics are easier to measure than impact metrics. So in this slide, we kind of covered some of the challenges in the current way impact is measured. One of them being activity-based metrics. I think, in other ways, not having full impact measures can also affect things like resource allocation. Are MSL spending their critical time with the HCPs or the stakeholders that are going to have the most impact on the patient? And one thing I oftentimes hear on the right, you'll see there's a little symptoms bullet point, and I've heard this concept multiple times now, so I call it the black hole, which is what ends up happening in this kind of impact insights continuum, if you will, is that, MSLs might submit their notes from their engagements that goes up somewhere and gets aggregated and given as feedback, hopefully to clinical development within medical affairs or potentially to commercial in a compliant manner. But then those teams aren't sure whether those insights are being acted on. So there's almost this kind of lack of a feedback loop, which
Yep.
impacts impact, right? I mean, I would think, and value.
Yeah, completely agree, Vera. I think measuring across all MA activities, right, is critical, right, in all of this. Because when you look at impact, right, you can look at it at, say, an individual level, MSL type level. You can look at it at a medical X handle level, a medical website level. You can look at it through what's coming through medical information. You can look at it through what's coming through product complaints, right? They're all very relevant. And it could be that there's some that comes through the commercial teams as well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But pulling all of that together and making sure that all those stakeholders that I just mentioned get that information, right, and are aware of that information. The MSL should be aware of what MedInfo's seeing or getting, what the medical website traffic is looking like, what the engagement is through those channels. And it goes the same, for all functions. And I think often we struggled with that because it's largely been a manual process.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas, like with you and your expertise, there's technology that can actually solve and help provide a solution, right, to that problem and to that pain point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but I think what I've also observed from a technological side is folks get excited about it's, Gen AI, it's this kind of hype thing. How can we apply it? What are the use cases in medical affairs? And I think that's all great. And I do think technology can really be helpful here in, taking high volume of data and being able to just simplify for medical affairs teams to be able to extract those insights to then be able to more easily cross-functionally collaborate, right? To be able to share those insights faster across teams, to ClinDev, commercial, within medical affairs. But oftentimes, I think the most important piece, actually, before even looping in any technology, is defining what you want to measure and what are those big challenges, and then see, okay, what technology fits the bill. Because for some teams, maybe you might not need AI. Like that might be, bringing a bazooka to the party, totally overkill. Like a spreadsheet might just do. But in certain cases, when you start to have multiple functions, you have a lot of data points, it's very hard for one person to really sift through that. And that's really, I think, where technology can come in to help medical affairs not only measure their impact, but also communicate their value across the board. With that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of skip through this to this slide because we've started talking about it. But, let's say if the current state, roughly speaking, is for the most part, I think most teams will measure activity metrics and operational metrics and compile insights reports, right, to share cross-functionally wherever necessary. So if teams wanted to go from just measuring operational metrics to trying to measure impact, what do examples of kind of impact measures look like?
Yep, so I think some of the ones that you've got here, Vera, right, if we start with that first one, claims data changes, right, or diagnostic code changes, I think are a really good objective handle. But if you can start applying some advanced analytics, rare disease in particular springs to mind, where patients often go through years of different HCP encounters, a number of misdiagnoses, but you can start now with technology beginning to go back. It ties into the EHR records as well. And you can almost measure, I'm going to use the word channel. I know a lot of medical people don't like using the word channel, but if you have consistent communication and medical messages across all of these, you can have a look, okay, here's my MSL team. Are we seeing any type of change in claims data or any change in diagnosis? Where we're deploying our social media handles, are we seeing any of that change? Information we're putting out in Congress, do we see any of that change? And I think it was Robin who made the point earlier. You can't measure that overnight, right? There has to be a bit of a longitudinal sense here, and that period may change a little bit with COVID because it was such an unknown. We could start seeing things within 2-3 months as people understood more about the disease and what therapeutics were available available, what vaccines were available that weren't at the beginning. And then some of the other ones here, right, I think are really important because we often kind of forget because we tend to think of them as soft sometimes, but things like, sentiment analysis or customer satisfaction, stakeholder satisfaction type scores, awareness scores, those are all important because they start giving you an early signal detection as to what's beginning to change, which then allows you to begin
Mhm.
being more proactive and identifying trends that then all boils down to what we've got here as implementation science, but the execution, of all of that. Whereas the ones on the right, like I said, they may be useful for some kind of operational type decision making, allocation of resources, where do we invest in communication, formal paths versus websites. It still doesn't get you to the outcome.
I think to add, Eddie, to what you're saying, because I know this slide is more examples than it is necessarily a almost framework to follow around, in the impact category. Here is, the 5 kind of categories of impact metrics, and this is how you know which category you fit into. These are just kind of tactical examples. But if you guys remember, there was that slide that we had where we defined impact value, and there was that Venn diagram, right? Of there's the value to the patient, right? So is their quality of life better? Is the safety profile better? Is just the experience of them receiving the medication better, or their interaction with HCP? Then there's the HCP themselves, and then there's the company. And you can throw in payers, right? Or maybe the government, like it could be more than just those 3. But and I'm curious, Eddie, on your perspective, I almost think of understanding what impact metrics are most important for your team therapeutic area is looking at those stakeholder needs. So start with the stakeholder in mind and then work backwards. If it's a patient, what's their journey, right? So in rare disease, diagnosis tends to be kind of the biggest blocker, if you will, to getting the best care. So from the patient's perspective, what is their journey? What do we hypothesize are the biggest gaps we can address? And then how can you establish impact metrics around measuring that? Like, is that possible? Can you get the claims data if you need the claims data, or compliantly, right? Or diagnostics data or EHR records, and then work backwards. Same thing with the company, right? Or same thing with the HCP. We're getting feedback from our Med EDU programs that HCPs, are more interested in XYZ topical area, right? So that's a need for HCPs. So how do we then convert that right into an impact measure? I mean, how would you approach if you were a medical affairs team, Eddie, today, and you're servicing a certain therapeutic area? How would you approach defining impact metrics?
So for me, it would start exactly what you said, right, from the different stakeholders and what they consider, right, to be of value. And I use the example of the A1C level, right, where for the healthcare provider, the practitioner, that may be the value, right? They've got the patient to that number, and for them, okay, I've got that patient medically stable. That was my goal, and the information that I've been given or communicated with by a company has allowed me to make informed decisions and, perhaps adjust a treatment or try treatment X instead of Y. For the patient, the value, right, may be more about quality of life, right? It doesn't necessarily,
Mhm.
like the numbers are a little bit meaningless unless you kind of feel better, unless you can engage in more of your daily activities or hobbies. And was at a panel with these patient advocates, and one of them was very clear. She's an advocate for this rare form of blindness, and she said, you've got to listen to what we as patient advocates value. I said, companies and sometimes HCPs are looking for cure. That's not necessarily we want quality of life. Can I,
Mhm.
or my son, it was a son in that case, with blindness, be able to navigate his own way to a bathroom in a restaurant? That was the value, right, for them. And if you start building backwards from that, then it allows you to start thinking of some of these impact examples that we have and how you go about trying to get to that impact. It could be evidence generation, it could be some type of impactful communication or some kind of, disease awareness campaign that's put in very understandable lay terms, for patients. So,
Mhm.
that's how I kind of start thinking about this, right? To use a kind of tongue-in-cheek example, right? If you're trying to lower cholesterol for the physician, it may be, I've got the cholesterol level down to what it should be in the lab test. For the patient, it may be, hey, now I can go and enjoy a cheeseburger, right, at this weekend. It then
Yeah.
gives you, some kind of satisfaction, right, and lifts your mood, whatever it is. So it's always hard to keep that perception of value for the stakeholder in mind, but it's something that we should be striving to do.
Do you think there's like for a team today that's on the call that has started to explore impact measures, given planning cycles and all of that? Do you have like practical steps that they can, that you think they can take to try to establish those measures going into next year?
Yeah, so to me, it's always, start small, right? Don't do everything at once. In your medical priorities, what is your one or two key priorities that you absolutely want to hit? Your resources may be limited. You can start with baby steps. You can socialize and agree on some kind of impact metric. But for me, Vera, it's also important to have buy-in that you can iterate, right? That it's almost going to be like a guided,
Mhm.
and they're actually going to all sit down, as a team and have a feedback session. What's working, what isn't? Was that impact metric the right one, for us as a company, for one of our stakeholders, for what they consider value? Science and medicine was built on failure, right? And getting away that kind of fear of failure, try it, have a go, try it, and if it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, it's still a positive experience because you learn, right? And you iterate and you try something else that might be impactful.
And another question and kind of what I'm hearing from what you're saying is ultimately this kind of iterative approach, experimental approach is additive. It is not going to you can still do all of the things you were doing before measurement wise, but it's like, how can you continue to innovate the way that you can hear your stakeholder, hear the patient needs, hear the stakeholder needs, and continue innovating on translating that into tactical execution for medical affairs. Another question I'm curious about, Eddie, is why bother changing? If I'm a team and, we've been measuring metrics in a certain way and, no one has asked the question almost of like why, we've always done it this way, if you will, why change?
Yeah, so for me, the whole landscape, right, and the context in which we operate and engage in is changing transformationally, right? We shared the examples, right, of social media, now the whole medical healthcare patient community having a voice. And we need to be ready to adapt and ideally try and be a little bit more future thinking, right?
Mm,
And ahead as to what trends, which goes back to some of those more longitudinal concepts. The world, right, is moving on. When I started working in pharma, mobile phones didn't exist. So they used to send me to places like Africa with a satellite phone that was
mhm.
bigger and heavier than my own suitcase. And I could say, okay, well, I still want to use a satellite phone because it's great, but the whole world is changing, right? And there's so much more now that you can do and achieve through a small mobile phone than could before. And it's the same, right? Medical practice changes and evolves, patient priorities, change and evolve, caregiver priorities, right, may change,
Right.
evolve, and we really need to be up there and looking at what you've got here, right, trying to get a more holistic view of the world, and where and through what. I'm going to use the word channels again, even if some folk don't like it, and think about how you're really being more effective, right, with those channels and deploying them, because you can scale up, right? You can start. I'm going to use the MSL as an example, one-on-one or one to small initially, but to me that's such an important, like, early warning system, signal detection. Then does that start translating through to what your local regional hospital is seeing, right, or your healthcare system is seeing? does that start translating to a national level, to regional level, right, to global levels? And we saw a lot of that real time with COVID, where initially it was one doctor in China, as I remember, who kind of started observing these patients coming in with these symptoms that he'd never encountered or experienced before. And that's kind of the equivalent for a company, like for an MSL. But then it became 5, then it became 10, then it became 100 HCPs. And so to me, it's always thinking about that holistic approach and how each of us, right, in whatever role we are, or even within medical, in whatever function we are, can actually add, to that value.
And to add to, I feel like there are a couple of really good points in there, and to add to perhaps the more futuristic, forward looking of why do we change? I think taking from the tech industry, I live in San Francisco, and I feel like San Francisco is a bubble of weird tech future, if you will. We have self-driving cars, like I can take that instead of Uber these days. And, you think about, well, why does Uber care or Google care to do Waymo? Why should we have self-drive? I mean, those, cost billions of dollars, just as much as a drug would, in a way to go through R&D to develop an innovation like that, right? But I think the reality is, if you're not addressing the patient need or the HCP need or the evolving needs of those stakeholders, someone else will. So I think there's also just, we want like the future of the world, whether it's from a tech perspective or from a medical perspective, there's a lot of exciting things. And why wouldn't we want to be a part of, enabling better quality of life for patients? And then there's just also the more, from I think a company perspective, the more tactical of someone will come in and solve that problem. So how do you as a company and as a team stay innovative within that? So that's kind of one thing I wanted to add from the tech side that we also see. And on, I think to your point around measuring impact, and I know we haven't really touched on the technology piece, but oftentimes what I see with teams, and something to keep in mind as you all are, whether it's defining or already measuring impact metrics, one thing I oftentimes see with teams from more of like the technical execution side of how do we leverage technology to now measure these things or generate reports or generate insights, whatever that might look like, is that teams their data tends to be siloed, which I know is not an unheard concept. We always talk about data silos, but here's what I mean by that. Typically what ends up happening is at the beginning of a formation of a team, they're probably using spreadsheets, right? Totally fine. Beautiful empty slate. You can effectively build on top of that and make wonderful decisions and move quickly. Then what ends up happening is whether it's in-house or a vendor, right? Someone gets brought in for like one activity or channel. So like just field medical insights, right? Or just med edu or just med info from a technical side. And what ends up happening there is, okay, now I have a med info cloud. Then I have a field medical, solution that pulls from CRM. Then I might have, a manual report for med edu. And unfortunately, the impact of that is that it continues to isolate your data because the data is just isolated at a different layer. And that what ultimately that means is it becomes hard to, as you scale, especially, to be able to merge that data and get that trend or get the holistic view that Eddie was talking about. So I think if you're a team, especially at the beginning, where you might be using spreadsheets to, for example, go through your field medical insights and generate reports, like what a wonderful place to be in, because the world is your oyster in terms of like setting up the technical foundation in the right way to support scale. However, I will say also, if you are in a stage where you might have different vendors across different channels, also do not worry. There is a way to be able to connect them. But I think that's just one thing to keep in mind, depending on where you're at from a technical perspective. And the last thing I'll say, on that front, in applying tech, I think the first piece is really understanding where you're at in your insights journey. I think there needs to be an understanding of the metrics that you're measuring and what exact challenges or problems from the team side that you want the technology to solve, and coming into evaluating whether to build something in-house, whether you're considering other vendors. If you come in with that plan, it's so much easier to evaluate. oftentimes what I also see is because Gen AI is it's hypey, basically, is what I'll call it. Teams get excited and they want something tangible. So they want to see use cases or they want to just see the capabilities, but it's almost in the reverse. Like you can get a checklist of capabilities from 20 different vendors. How are you going to decide who's the right one? If you start from the problem first, that when you talk to vendors or you talk to your internal IT team to do a build out, it just becomes a lot easier. So that's a big pattern I see where you can ultimately get to the same outcome either way. I just think the latter outcome is going to spend a lot of your time in discussions and capabilities meetings that you probably don't have to spend. Whereas you can spend on the tactical execution piece and measuring impact and all of that. So anyway, wanted to add that piece in there. So I know we have about 10 minutes. There's folks who sent some questions. So Eddie, I don't know if you have maybe remaining thoughts. Otherwise, if folks want to ask questions, we'll kind of start digging through those.
I think you summed it up. You summed it up well, Vera. What, just to add on to what you were saying, when I and my teams were working on COVID, it was all very manual trying to get information across all different channels, right? Even if they were just medical, MedInfo, MSLs, headquarters, whatever it is. And we had a pair of unfortunate interns whose job was manually pulling all of that together. And because COVID was such a fast moving disease, we were being asked to do this on a weekly basis. And it's
Crazy.
painful, right? As you can imagine, and on manual, the data wasn't always as robust as we wanted. But as you're saying, that's a problem where, as you've been articulating, there's a tech solution that can really make you much more effective and much more impactful, and getting closer to almost to real time, as much as you can, because that also starts helping you to identify trends and addressing trends.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think field medical obviously is I think the number one use case most teams will start off with in terms of adding technology because, sifting through thousands of insights manually, which is typically what happens in a spreadsheet. I mean, it's grunt work. You might miss stuff. It's human nature and you can't do it as frequently, right? So it's very hard to do that in real time depending on the volume. So I think tech can really come in at that point and help simplify that all the way to actually enabling more of that holistic view, because a lot of the technology and Gen AI has helped with this, can take a lot of different types of formats of data, right? So MedEDU is an example. That's free text in the sense of usually you get medical education outcome reports, right? From different grants that you issue. Those medical education outcome reports will have things like surveys. So you might have pre-post, competency, knowledge, performance improvements, et cetera. Today, if you wanted to take all of your medical education outcomes reports and get outcomes data from that to determine which grants or which programs have been effective, right? It's manual. You have to go this 50-page PowerPoint, copy paste, like create this whole, database. I mean, that's just insane. Where technology can help. And I think those are the scenarios where tech can have ultimately the most impact. And I think that's, I hope for medical affairs over the next coming years, and I'm seeing this happen. Folks are starting to establish that technical foundation. And then over time, we'll get to a spot where it is as real time, as it can be. So, all right. So with that, let me look through some of the questions. If you guys have any, feel free to pop them into the chat. All right. So Paul here, and this is not necessarily a question. This is perhaps more of a comment, but maybe a good topic for discussion, which is Paul. So Paul mentions, I've had difficulty isolating the impact specific to medical, given the degree of cross-functional work we do. Was the impact really driven by medical or attributed to marketing, ClinOps, corporate affairs, etc.? Often these functions are who we want to show our impact and value to. Their response can often be not so fast medical. Hold on. Our function had a big hand in the success you're describing. So I'm curious, Eddie, how do you, perhaps your experience, have you seen this as well? And how have you put the boundaries, if you will, on what is medical impact versus other functions?
So to me, right, it's going back and defining and aligning first on that unmet medical need. We had a couple of examples there, like time to diagnosis was one. For COVID, it was it was time from diagnosis to treatment, right? Because the drugs had to be administered within 5 days. But that was something that medical took as a metric, right, in alignment with commercial. And commercial had their own metrics that were some of the more classical ones, HCP reach by sales and eventually prescriptions. But I think it's important to get that alignment so that you all agree, because at the end of the day, you're all working for the same company. And to me, what that really means is you've got your healthcare provider and your patient as your key stakeholders as well. So you should all be pointing towards that common tip, right, of impact and value of what you're trying to do. So you set your alignment. You said medical is going to be doing X. Here's how we're going to measure it and show impact, and here's how we feel we can demonstrate that value. And then commercial can do their own things. And again, you can do that very compliantly. And you can share, right, some of that information depending on a company's risk tolerance. Most of the companies I've worked with, you can share a lot of that at more senior levels of the organization. Maybe not at the field level, but that alignment, that agreement, that buy-in working cross-functionally, I think is critical.
And I'm curious, would there be, this is kind of like a lay example, if you will. So tell me if this would not make any sense. But let's say I'm in rare disease and then we have the commercial team and we have the medical team, right? And let's say one of medical's objectives is, we want to inform, or we're going to put in a lot of efforts to educate around proper diagnosis or what to look for, right? Because usually there's delayed diagnosis in rare disease. So if that was the case, then likely that team would be looking at diagnostic data, right, compliantly to see if, depending on their efforts, if there's been a shift, call it every 6 months or however long. Commercial's goals, rather, are likely scripts or revenue related. So do you see, in that case, could commercial also be like, well, we spent all these efforts educating HCPs commercially, so actually the diagnosis increases that you're seeing are due to our efforts?
I mean, of course, you can always get, right, some kind of objection from other cross-functional, but I think that's where that proactive alignment up front. And if you need to, right, you can even have like a charter that spells it out and who's going to be accountable for what, right, and how, and having those KPIs, those metrics built into that charter that are shared. My last company, like all the cross-functional VPs would get together and we would all review our goals and objectives and we would all align, right? And then we would say, hey, Eddie, you take those, that's your focus. We're going to do these other ones that are complementary to yours. And it's not just commercial. You should have the same thing with clinical, potentially, with your health economics outcomes folk, if they're not within medical. Evidence generation, real world evidence is another one that, depending on the company, sits within medical or sometimes is completely separate. Sometimes is within clinical development. But having that transparent, candid conversation, and by the way, allowing people to pressure test each other's objectives. Hey, I don't agree with that one, or the one you've put on there is much easier to achieve than the one I have, and how do we calibrate and set those? I think is the approach.
It sounds like really it's getting that alignment as much as possible upfront, inclusive of any differing perspectives, disagreements, etc. So then that way, when the time does roll around in terms of this is the progress that's been made, it's just very clear who was accountable or who owns what. There shouldn't be like a debate about it later.
No, that's right. You have your discussion, your debate, your dissent, sometimes your arguments, within that room. But as soon as you walk out of that room, you're all family, right? With the same goal in mind, and you're just adding different angles and aspects to it.
Yes. Thank you. So Charlie also asked, thoughts on how to directly measure impact on patient care. Is anyone using claims data to demonstrate changes in diagnosis or treatment?
Yes, I can speak to the COVID experience, which was time from treatment to diagnosis. And then what we were doing there was overlaying the high risk groups geographically. Obesity was the one, unfortunately, that you might expect, right, in the States and now many other countries. But you could then start identifying those HCPs, clinics, healthcare systems that had the largest number of those patients under their care. And then you can deploy your MSLs against those, or if they're only looking after one or two patients, you can use your digital technologies. And then the same with rare disease. We worked with our analytics people to put together a diagnostic algorithm that was intended to speed time to diagnosis. And the focus there was on underserved populations because it was a rare disease that was agnostic of race or ethnicity, but the diagnostic rates were much lower for some ethnicities. And you could deploy against that and show if that time to diagnosis increased for those underserved populations. And you could, right? Like I said earlier, it was probably 2 to 3 months, but it was very measurable. But set your aims properly, right? So we were looking at something like a 5% increase in diagnosis over it was a 3 to 6 month period. As like I was going back, baby steps, pilot first. Are you showing anything rather than go for something that's completely unrealistic?
Got it. Yeah. Well, I know we're running a little bit over. So thank you for sharing those very tangible examples. Because, one of the next questions that Amit had was about talking about diagnostics data changes on the slide, which I think ties to what you just answered about. So I know there's a couple of other comments which we don't have time to go through because we're going to wrap things up. And I think perhaps a second session should be in order because there's one thing that we didn't cover that I just thought of is measuring the short-term impact versus the long-term, because some impact measures, they take a while, but could there be pressure sometimes on teams to showcase ROI on a much faster time frame? So is there a way almost to balance that? We'll put a pin in that for next time. Thank you, everyone. This should be recorded. We'll post the recording. Feel free to ping either of us if you have any other questions about impact or about how tech can enable it. And thank you, Eddie, for joining me for this event.
No, thank you, Vera. Pleasure as always. And we'll be making the slides available, right?
Yes, I'm happy to make the slides available. Awesome. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Happy Halloween.